Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Making Action Happen. I'm Sarah Blackhurst.
And I'm Brian McCain.
And we've got the legendary, and I say this because we only speak his name in hushed and reverent tones. Back on the show again is our good friend Mike Beasley. And I'll just say this, if you know, you know, with regard to Mike Beasley. So you are just coming off of a 120-day Bizarro Land session. Can I say Bizarro Land? That would maybe best describe this. This was a weird session. I remember, I think we were toward the end of February, and I always think about my mom's birthday's right around that time, and I think I'm spending more time on the phone talking to Beasley on this time of year, my mom's birthday, than I am talking to my mom. But that was not the case this year. This year was bizarre in every way. So can we set the tone a little bit with this by doing a quick little civics lesson, especially with regard to what's happening next?
Well, it's good to see you again. How set the tone?
For the session. Next. Yeah, for the session. So I think one of the things, so my phone was blowing up the last 2 days with people asking me, okay, what's next? What's next? What happened with this bill? Where's this going? They're all trying to figure out, okay, now what's next with regard to the session?
So let me just say, in 35 years of being around this process, I've never seen so many bills still alive towards the end of session. So when we started 2 weeks out, there were still 350 bills alive out of 650 that were introduced, and half of those were House bills still in the House. So in my mind, that makes it a very difficult environment, not only for legislators, but folks like Action 22 and others to kind of figure out and watch what's going on to make sure that we can affect policy so it isn't just affecting us. And so having said that, they managed to get through several of those bills. Around 40 or so died on midnight on Tuesday because they didn't have enough time to get through the process.
What's the normal number on that in a regular year?
In a single number,
5,
just
6,
very few.
Yeah,
it's not unheard of how they manage their calendar, but it is unusual. And but the sheer volume that they had left, and we can talk about that in a minute. But so after the governor has from 10 days from the end of session, so until June 10th, to sign all the bills that have been sent to his desk. And he's going to have quite a few. I would say conservatively, he's going to have around 250 bills on his desk to sign by June 10th, which is quite a bit of work for the governor. And you're going to be reading his name every day in the paper for the next month because he's going to be traveling around the state, I'm sure, signing bills and talking to folks about what they just accomplished. So
I looked the other day just to see how many he'd actually signed already, and it was not. It was like, I think I counted maybe 24. Just looking at how many he'd already signed into law, which is usually it's the other way. Like he's got like 50 or something to sign by this time of by the end of the session, right?
Well, if you look at statistically, I think the governor had only been delivered one bill in the month of January and February to sign. So that was a good early indicator that the work among the majority party in the legislature and the governor hadn't really progressed to a point where they could start moving bills. And we were joking on the last night of session that I now know how billionaires who want to give away their money have a hard time because the legislature were billionaires, especially with federal funds this time, and they really struggled with giving away their money. So I said, well, now we all know how Oprah feels.
Free car. You get a free car.
They wanted to give a free car to everybody, but they really struggled on how to do it. And really important, policies, especially in housing and behavioral health, a lot of federal spending there. And my big fear, you saw how hard it was to pass the legislation to obligate, to create the programs to spend those federal dollars. And my big fear right now, as a casual observer of the process, is that we're going to give a lot of money back to the federal government at the end of these programs, because the legislative part was easy. Getting the money out the door is actually going to be the hard part. And I especially worry about that in housing. I think the last count I had, for example, that the Division of Housing needs to add 60 FTE just to on top of all the employees they have now. And I just really fear for them and how they're going to get this done. And I think we all have an obligation now to try and help them meet their mission.
And there's a time clock on that as well, as far as getting that money out, and how, we're on a time clock. So they've got a year?
They have, depending on the program, they have until 2026 to get the money out, officially obligated and spent out the door, or that monies will revert back to the federal government.
So they have
between 2024 and 2026.
Right. So 24, they have to have an obligated. 26, it has to be out the door, right?
It depends on the program, but
okay.
yes.
So that was one thing that I saw that some people were throwing around. Will they do an emergency or special session to designate that funding?
Well, a lot of that spending guidelines from the state legislature of federal funds was done in this last session in these bills that they passed. And so now again, so that seemed to be hard, right, to the outside world. But I will say from experience, the hard part isn't going to be the legislation they just passed that set up these rules. It's actually going to be getting it done and getting it out the door. And I think you saw that in the housing summit that Action 22 had, where, DOLA continues to wait for the ink to dry on these bills so they can get information out to local governments on how to spend, in their case, the housing dollars.
Okay.
It's going to be a very, very heavy lift. There was a rumor that they were going to do a special session. So you haven't heard any more that they would do a special session to decide what ARPA was, or define ARPA?
Well, we had seen the big ticket items in housing and behavioral health, for example, introduced. But I think what we saw was in some of the other bills that had one-time federal funds in it, we saw the dollar amount shrink. And so we knew at that point that something was up, and that the executive branch and the leadership in the legislature was trying to negotiate a deal with proponents of initiatives, for example, that cut property tax, to get them to withdraw their initiatives and then replace that with in Senate Bill 238, a very late bill, $700 million in temporary tax, property tax reduction that will go back to the original law in the next, after 2 years, in exchange to withdraw those initiatives. And so that is in part what we saw happening. And so the legislature spent it. If they had it, they spent it. And in many cases, it was in both parties, but mostly just the majority party and on some of these key ticket items. And so I don't think you're going to see a special session necessarily, because there's really no money left to spend after you do property tax breaks, for example.
Okay.
Interesting. I wanted to jump in on some, and I guess there was a little bit of drama around this, but we were frustrated with what we've come to rely on with regard to stakeholder process, and how there was a failure. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to piss some people off when I say it, but that stakeholder process that's so vitally important, there was a lot of failures on that. Would you start with kind of explaining to our listeners who maybe aren't as aware of what that is and why that's important, and then talk about what happened in this session?
So legislators are not obligated necessarily in law to bring in stakeholders both for and against a particular issue. But it does make for better policy when that happens. They're not fun meetings necessarily, especially if you're not winning the argument. And I've been in plenty of those meetings over the years. But it is important you get better legislation out of that. Even if folks disagree at the end of the day, at least ideas were shared. And I think you're talking about collective bargaining as a recent example. I know that a recent podcast you had created a little bit of consternation by the proponents of collective bargaining. And what I would just say is this. For me, the definition of collective bargaining is more than just a 15-minute Zoom call with one or two association proponents, and then we're going to do it anyway. That's not productive, but it is their right and it is their privilege to do it that way. But I don't think then it is fair to then criticize those criticizing the process. And so, having said all of that, the collective bargaining bill is reflective of several amendments, not necessarily from local governments, because now the bill doesn't apply to higher ed or K through 12. It only applies to county government. And having said that, you know, it was really a conversation between Republican and Democrat legislators on how to improve the bill. So I'll call it the special interests were both the unions and the opponents were kind of largely pushed out of that negotiation between legislators. And as a result, there were some significant amendments. And so I think still try and meet the goal of folks that want a stronger voice in their workplace and county commissioners who have to manage, you know, county governments in a very complex and difficult time in our history. So at the end of the day, I wouldn't have chosen this path to go down to get to that same language, but it is, again, it was the bill sponsor's prerogative.
When you've seen really effective stakeholder processing in the past, what did that look like?
Well, I think ultimately the goal of any legislator is to see if they can't get everyone on board with amendments. And so like you would see, like if you're in your own family kitchen negotiating with your kids, you know, I'll let you go to the movies if you do A and B, you know, you go out and mow the lawn, you know, you can apply that same philosophy or that same undertaking to, well, if I do this amendment to this bill, will you go to neutral or will you support it? Or a lot of times I'll go to people and say, look, if I get this language, I'll be for this bill, but otherwise I can't do it.
Right.
And so that is, you know, that give and take. And there are quite a few legislators in both parties that are just really good at that. And at the end of the day, you know, legislators, for the most part are quite honorable and will say, look, I can't do what you want to do. You're just going to have to oppose the bill and we'll see what happens. And so there was quite a bit of that. Representative Roberts from the Eagle County area tried to come up with a compromise to get some liquor initiatives or liquor delivery initiatives off the November ballot. And he wasn't successful in that, but he really tried and he brought all those people in. And, you know, the liquor lobby is, you know, they're hard. They're hard to work with. And they all need a drink, frankly, to lighten up a little bit. And I'm not one of those, so I can speak out of school on that, but to a degree. But, you know, it's just a give and take, right? Instead of a give, you know, I'm just going to take and I'm just going to give you my message on how I'm going to pass this over your objection. Sometimes that happens. Many times it doesn't.
So let's talk about the legislation that we worked on in particular. There was stuff outside of that. And just so everybody knows, so this is sort of our process with Mike, with Beasley, as I refer to him. He is our lobbyist pro bono, which means when they want to when anybody at the protocol is that they have a conversation with Beasley, and he helps us interpret what's going on, and then we work with we have a specific group. Our board gets together at the beginning of each session, and we talk about what we anticipate will happen, or some of the things that will be the really hot buttons. And we have a couple of our members who sort of weigh in on that discussion. And then what are the big priorities for us? What are the things? So Action 22 Board of Directors does not take a position until a bill is actually introduced. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the reason that stakeholder process is really an important one, because a lot of the work on what we would support or what we wouldn't, or what we'd like to see happen and what wouldn't, happens in theory, before the bill's introduced. We saw a really good example of this last year when the governor did the whole transportation funding. That was very in-depth, and we had lots of discussions. Nobody got everything that they wanted, but by the time it was introduced, there was enough of a consensus that we had to support that bill. Then during the session, Beasley and I will talk often. He meets with our board on a regular basis to see what's going on and what we would support and what we wouldn't. But that whole amendment process, everything that goes into a very quick management of 700 on average bills, takes a lot of communication. So I wanted to explain that because we always get questions on that, as how does this all work and how do we represent our membership on that? And that's really the nuts and bolts of how it's done.
And we have to pick our fight for which bills and legislation we support or oppose. We can't do it over everything. It's a specific focused group of bills.
It is a specific focused group of bills, and we don't consider anything that our membership doesn't bring to us. So if our membership says, would you take a look at this bill, that's when we put it on the monitor list, and then we have those discussions from there. So I don't know how many total we had on the monitor list or that we took a position on this session for Action 22, but it's never a ton. It's never more than a few dozen bills, because some of this is just not something that we get into. So I just wanted to talk out that process a little bit so everybody understood. There were some bills early on. So let's talk about the bills early on and then the bills toward the end. There wasn't very much early on. I'm not going to give the numbers because we'll all forget the numbers in a couple days. But the Lawnmower Bill was something that we talked about early on in the session. This was an interesting bill, and then the outcome was interesting on it as well. So initially, we opposed the Lawnmower Bill. It was, I think, it was Hansen's bill. It was Senator Hansen's bill, and he was trying to fill gaps on some environmental issues that he saw that we could fill the gaps in on. But that one was resolved fairly early in the session, and we were all kind of laughing at it a little bit because we were calling it the Lawnmower Bill, because one component of it was that you wouldn't be able to buy any outdoor like lawnmowers or chainsaws or whatever over a certain horsepower. Of course, that got down, but there was a lot of other things in that bill.
It was really a hodgepodge of environmental policy brought by Senator Hansen from Denver and some of the environmental lobby. And once, honestly, the bill was introduced to basically, in my mind, prohibit the sale of any kind of outdoor equipment with certain size small motors. And it was something that once the public heard about, what do you mean I can't have a lawnmower? Members of both political parties were having town hall meetings, and were coming back in that first couple of weeks once the media branded the Lawnmower Bill. Again, even though it had other important things in it, like a study at the Colorado State University to look at how to reduce emissions in our agricultural sector. I mean, that's a very important topic, and something that the Farm Bureau, for example, feels very strongly about based on, I think, in my mind, the experience of what's going on in the European Union on the ag sector there, and that we probably shouldn't do it like them. We should probably think about it ahead of time.
Right.
Generically speaking. But boy, once that bill was branded the Lawnmower Bill, even though they got rid of the prohibitions in it and replaced it with incentives to buy battery powered lawnmowers, blowers, weed eaters, that kind of thing, it just really just wobbled over into the House, where ultimately it died on Tuesday night at midnight as part of those 40 bills. It just didn't get called up because there was just a lot of, it was branded in a way that it really just couldn't survive. And Republicans and marginal Democrats, and what I mean by that are Democrats whose seats are more competitive, they just weren't going to be branded, in my opinion, with voting for a bill with that narrative attached to it. So that's, that was a bill that we were concerned about. We opposed, part of a very large coalition that was opposed to it. I'm not sure, or we expressed deep concerns about it, rather, because the Farm Bureau and others wanted their language. and most of those elements, solar garden language, to readjust credits for solar gardens that industry really, really wanted. My guess is we'll all come back, but in separate bills next session.
Which seems the smarter way to go about it instead of trying to shove everything into one bill. But that's a great lesson learned.
I think the experience is the more things you put in a bill, the more likely it is that there will be enough folks that hate one part or another to actually, kill the bill. And I think that was in part what happened there.
Yeah. So let's talk about the packaging bill, the 1355, which was initially, this was, in my opinion, a bizarre premise. And I don't know how, I hadn't seen for sure how that turned out. But the premise of this bill was, initially, it was a good idea to do something to actually create recycling centers, especially in rural communities. One of the things that we would love to see is recycling centers. The approach to this bill was a little bit bizarro land, in my opinion. It was to create nonprofit organizations that any producers that did any kind of packaging would have to become members of that nonprofit organization, but then it would also give that nonprofit organization power to levy fines, and all of those proceeds from membership and from levying fines would go to producing recycling centers. That there was a lot of amendments and a lot of exemptions on that bill, but being in an organization, I took exception to forcing anybody into membership, number one, and number two, giving the power of a nonprofit to levy fines seemed a little
excessive.
Thank you. Yes, excessive. Excessive's a fine word for that. I couldn't think of a nicer word.
This is an example when special interests come to a legislature, and I wasn't, involved in this bill necessarily, but from afar, this is what happens when special interests come in, and they, in this case, bottlers of soda, things like that. They see their product and the way they package their product kind of dwindling, and how to finance new ways, to keep that market alive, that the ability to deliver, in this case, I'll call it soda, keep that alive. So it's not unusual to see special interests try to come in and influence the legislature. What is unusual is the approach they took and the way you described it. And it really bothered a lot of people, and they lacked the votes in the Senate towards the end of session from both political parties. And so you did see some amendments done to it. There's more of a study component, but ultimately, the policy will move forward. And I think for me, the troubling nature is to create a nonprofit outside of government, rooted in law, that has that ability to get into businesses. And so we're going to have to see how this moves forward. I will credit the proponents of the bill. They had very good lobbyists who were well ahead of the game and counted their votes, and were quite effective in achieving the goal. But philosophically now, with Tabor and constraints on budgets, there was a real heavy debate about, is there really a market for recycling? Is most of this stuff ending up in a landfill because China, for example, isn't buying these materials anymore? It was all part of the debate, both in the lobby and on the floor of the House and the Senate. And so we'll have to just see how this one goes. But the proponents got a lot of what they wanted. We'll have to see how these fees are assessed moving forward. And I suspect we'll see legislation on this as early as next year, again, as they continue to tweak it and move towards their ultimate goal that you described.
I want to talk about 3 more bills, and then I want you to give us a report on the housing. And some of these are housing that I want to talk about next, but sort of the package of housing bills and some of the 3 that I want to talk about really quick with you were frustrating for us because I saw them as adding burden with very little without the stakeholder process really being in place, and adding burden at a time where
it's tough.
It's to the breaking point. Yeah, yes. We're to the breaking point on some of those, and I got kind of angry about some of those. So let's talk about 1244, which was the Air Toxins Bill.
1244, that's a good example where there wasn't a whole lot of stakeholdering, and it was brought by Earth Justice and what I will describe, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but more of the fringe of the environmental community. They haven't traditionally been involved like other environmental groups on a day-to-day basis over the years. And what they're trying to do is to create a program in the Department of Health that would identify toxins in our environment. And it's important to distinguish the difference between what we've done in the past as a legislature and as a state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change. This is really, in their mind, the proponents who are very passionate about, are we polluting, not in terms of, haze or greenhouse gas emissions, but are we polluting our communities from various manufacturing, whether it's from the burning of coal to manufacture energy, or to in Lakewood, a company that manufactures sterilized medical equipment that they use in surgeries, I guess, and things like that.
Right.
Are the byproducts of that manufacturing process emitting poison to a level that is unsafe, and killing people, creating high levels of cancer and that type of thing? And so to me, I described this as I was negotiating on behalf of Action 22 and Aurora Economic Development and others to say, look, you've got a bill here that you're limited to 5 toxins, but we don't know what they are. And as it was introduced, into my words, and granted,
Right.
people may disagree in my assessment, but this is how I would describe it. They were identifying 5 toxins. They were getting into existing permits of over 2,500 businesses in Colorado that are manufacturing everything from a major coal plant in Pueblo to the dry cleaner in Alamosa. We're all at risk that somehow this group of unelected officials in Denver were going to say, well, we're going to pick X toxin, and we're going to say that you have to reopen your permit and you have to mitigate the emission of that we know we didn't give you much warning that we were going to do. And if you don't do it, you have to shut your business down. And it was all based largely on an Oregon law. I don't know about you, but I don't really run in circles where people say, I'd really like to move my business to Oregon. Right. And so when you're thinking about expanding businesses here or attracting new businesses, that uncertainty was unthinkable and unmanageable. And, so you've got that strong view that I just described, plus the real passion of proponents who say, look, we're building refineries and honestly, crematoriums, that cremate bodies. That was one of the businesses at risk here. And we're saying that we don't want you in our communities anymore because we don't know what you're emitting. And so for me, it was like flying an airplane while you're trying to build it. Right. And that was the example that I used with the legislature to say, look, why don't you figure out what your inventory of toxins are? And then let's figure out how we want to deal with that in terms of permitting. And whether it's new permitting moving forward, because some permits will expire and then they have to be, reapproved. And we just struggled with that back and forth. And it was one of the most lobbied bills this session. So at the end of the day, there was a compromise in the Senate, and the new senator from Pueblo was instrumental in, protecting jobs in Pueblo and in Southern Colorado. So I'll give him credit for that. Where he, worked with both parties, Republicans and Democrats, the president of the Senate as well, to say, look, we're not going to let the bureaucracy in the Department of Health and the Air Quality Control Commission, just decide what they want to do with, in a boardroom in Denver. If they're going to want a new permit program, they got to come back to the legislature in 2027 after we do some monitoring of emissions. And then they need to come back and get legislative approval.
Right.
And that is what's most significant in this bill and the outcome of it. Because what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is the environmental community just wants to shove everything in the Air Quality Control Commission and then give them really unbridled power like no other agency in Colorado. And you can see the business community and members of both political parties say, you know what, the legislature should have a say in this. And I think that, and so that amendment was added to do largely that, to come back to the legislature for any type of new permitting in 2027. There will be oversight each fall by the standing committees.
Right.
And this was probably one of the most lobbied bills of the session. It's not perfect. Both sides were completely miserable in the end.
Yeah.
Normally, I would say that results in a good policy outcome. I can't honestly say that. I believe that. I believe that what we have here is a can of worms that we've opened, and we're going to continue over the next few years to put the worms back in the can, or at least train them to go in a certain direction.
Well, there's two things, and I want to say Nick Henriksen, who is the senator there, not only did he have some discussion with you, but he did reach out to us and called me several times on this and some other bills, and we really appreciated that. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about what we expect and how we deal with our legislators. So he did a good job on that side. I will say that with regard to this bill, those worms are going to grow teeth and start attacking everything around them. I'm deeply concerned about the bill, but in part because of something you touched on just really briefly. It's that we've set up for all of these regulatory commissions or these decision makers, these advisory committees or whatever, and we saw a whole bunch more proposals for these again this session, but they're not elected. They don't have to answer to anybody. They're appointed, and they're the ones that are making the decision on this. So I was happy with the part of the bill that makes them go back to the legislature for some of this, but the idea of reopening permits or making people reapply for permits, any of those, and there were several bills that did this, that were trying to do that in a process that is already so bogged down on the permitting, that's pretty bothersome.
Well, it is. And at the end of the day, let me say this, and we talked a lot about stakeholdering in this call. Representative Kennedy from the Golden, Jefferson County area is one of my favorite legislators to work with because he actually does engage. He was very involved in every amendment. He told both sides of this issue yes and no. And he really did try to thread several needles here. And
right.
So I really do want to give him credit because he's really one of the more thoughtful legislators, and he really tried. We knew what his ultimate goal was. And there are people in Pueblo, for example, in Commerce City, for example, that have grown up around emitters of all different types, whether it's a refinery or a coal plant or manufacturing industries like in Lakewood or Nevada, who just, they're concerned. They don't know what they don't understand what they emit. They want to exceed what the federal government is saying is safe. And I get that because they believe that folks who are in poverty or of color or both are unfairly affected by these types of businesses. And I really do respect that. I grew up initially right around the refinery in Commerce City. And so I know how they feel. And I've seen cancer in my own family. I don't know necessarily what's caused it. So we have to respect where those folks are coming from. But we have to also respect that you can't just blow up these businesses with very little notice, without understanding And it has to be done. If we're going to have this debate, we should do it in the light of day, not in a conference room in Denver. Let's take it to the legislature where that belongs. And that was really the pillar that most people fought for. I can't say enough again about Representative Kennedy or the Colorado Chamber. Right. Lauren Furman, their new president. She's an absolute star, respected by both political parties. We were part of that coalition. Yep. And I think we made progress, and I think it will come back again.
Okay, cool. 1362 and 1363, and just because they're right next to each other, I get those two mixed up. But it was what I'm calling the Metro District Bill, which got killed ultimately. But I really appreciate Representative Wiseman on that one. And then 13, the other one was the statewide. Building codes. So can you talk about first the Metro District bill that got killed? Because there were, to be completely fair, there were a number of components. There was just one thing about that bill that we had to oppose it, but it was a very respectful interaction with regard to that. There were some things in that bill that I thought really should be revisited on the Metro District bill.
So for the folks that are listening, since the voters passed the Tabor Amendment in the early 90s, it really made it difficult it stopped local government, cities and counties from doing the traditional investments that they would normally make to build residential or commercial development, the roads, the water, the sewer, the common owned areas like parks, that type of infrastructure, water reservoirs, provide for new growth, new development, people moving to Colorado. And we're at 5.7 million people now, right? Which is quite a bit more since Tabor passed in the early 90s. And so this bill and a lot of times what happens is the developer will come in and they will own the land and they will go in and they will advance money to build that infrastructure themselves. And then they will issue debt to pay themselves back for that advancement that will be paid for by the people who live or work in those communities.
Right.
And this bill had a huge, in my mind, it stopped that because it disrupted that traditional sense. It basically said a developer could own some land, but someone else would have to come in my mind, and do that. And why would Representative Wiseman not want growth, or the proponents of the bill, to pay its own way?
Right.
And it's because a lot of times some of what we've seen in the last 25 years is developers come in and they advance those dollars, and then they buy that debt, and they charge a higher interest rate, for example, than more than 6 or 7%. It might be 12 or 13%, or they might create a penalty for paying those dollars back early. Or they might just ignore the community that they live on. And I'll come back to that point in just a second.
Right.
And so, they were really what the proponents were trying to do is to provide some consumer protection in this space. Unfortunately, the proponents of that bill really weren't interested in compromising.
Right.
And they they really felt strongly about, the way that they had written the bill to make it more difficult to do that. But they also put in their bill, more disclosure on debt to consumers when they move into those communities. They notice for meetings those things that just really instinctually make sense. More right. Disclosure of those districts at the Department of Local Affairs about what the fiscal condition of those districts are. And so there were some amendments offered, that set interest rates based on outside verified, what the going rate was versus stopping the program, that type of debt issuance outright. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, that bill did die in the Senate in a bipartisan vote. And the consensus by the Democrat that voted to kill it and the Republicans is we have to have growth pay its own way. Right. Local governments are not going to be able to afford to advance these expenses moving forward. So I do think this issue will come back. For someone like me, I live in a newer development in Jefferson County. I actually pay more mills to my district than I pay to the school district. And the developer, in my mind, wasn't very good to work with. Right. They were hard to, they were frankly, in my mind, abusive to the homeowners that were on that board. And so I got mad, and I just literally last week got elected to my Metro District board. And the first thing I'm going to do is to make sure that that developer is fired from managing the district. And so the statute in my case works, but I'm a professional complainer, as you know. And so I knew what I was doing, and a lot of people don't. And so there needs to be more done here by the Special District Association to educate people, by real estate agents and developers to let people know the kind of debt that they're going into in these types of communities and what that really means. I pay, in my case, $3,000 more in my property taxes than the people across the street. But what do I get for that? I get more amenities like parks, open space, taking care of those common owned areas, and I'm paying for all of the infrastructure around me, the roads and the sewers.
Right.
And so that is that bill in a nutshell. Representative Wiseman is one of the smartest legislators down there. He's one of my one of my favorites.
No doubt.
His heart is completely in it for consumers. We have to just work to find a balance, and that balance just wasn't there yet.
So I hope, and I hope you'll convey to him on our behalf appreciation for reaching out and having the conversation, but that we'd like to see parts of that all the way up to investment, because we have to have that, because it's a housing issue. We have to be able to have that component in there.
And let's be clear, let's bring it home for people in the Action 22 footprint. Mm-hmm. This is not a thing that we just worry about in the Denver metro area, and COVID has really kind of underscored that. And there's high inflation and the recession, I think, that we're slipping into. People can now work from anywhere. And if you've got good broadband, which is another policy that Action 22 is very involved in, if you've got robust internet connection, that you're starting to see more and more people want to move into, let's call it, rural Colorado. And so there's no local government down there that can afford to do the things that I just described to you. And we're going to see more and more of these districts. And so if you want to bring more people, more businesses, and attract and retain the folks that you have and provide affordable housing, we need this tool, or they need to get rid of Tabor. And I don't believe the voters are going to do that. So we can't really throw the baby out with the bathwater. This concept will come back. I think you'll see multiple bills next session, and I know Action 22 will be on the forefront.
So thank you for that. Let's talk statewide building codes, and then let's talk housing, and we'll wrap it up with that.
Building codes is one where this was a priority of the governor and the energy office, and I want to credit Will Tour in the Colorado Energy Office for being so collaborative, and his people in his office. They really want a green building code. And part of it is their goal is ultimately Colorado will be a carbon neutral state, which means everything on the grid will be carbon neutral.
Right. And
so as we build new construction moving forward around, let's call it the 2030 timeframe, and someone goes in and pulls a permit to remodel a commercial or residential structure, that building should be built or modified in a way that not just does the traditional heating, gas heat, or air conditioning, for example, or kitchen appliances, but that it is wired for electricity, for a heat pump, or a fire, a non-gas stove, so an electric stove and that kind of thing, and to really try and get our construction and remodeling back to a carbon-free grid in our lifetime. And I'm old, so I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen in my lifetime. But so that was the goal of the bill. There was an amendment by Senator Simpson that exempted communities under 30,000 or less from that bill. So most of the communities in Action 22, and I credit him and the bill sponsor and the Energy Office for working with Senator Simpson. And one of the arguments that I think he made effectively is this stuff is expensive. Right. And if you look no further than, why do we really need a state mandate to do this? And the answer in my mind is no. And look no further than Superior and Louisville that did it before the fires that we had a few months back. And you saw then the community said, now, wait a minute, I'm trying to rebuild my house, and you can't add $10, $20, or $30,000 to the price of this house, I may never want to drive an electric vehicle. Why does my garage need to be wired for an electric vehicle?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but I love my gas fire pit in my backyard. I don't want to get rid of that. You can't roast marshmallows off a light bulb. That's not a fire pit. That's an easy bake oven. That's what that is. And so, people like that kind of element in their life. And you saw then, as a result, Superior and Louisville withdrew part of their ordinance, that mandated building code, because people couldn't afford it. And that's really the basic bottom line. And so now that there will be a conversation over the next few years what that building code should look like. Incentives, I think, additional incentives to switch out appliances, to go as carbon free as you can. And that's ultimately what that bill will do. We're still digesting those amendments, but the bottom line is a lot of rural Colorado was exempted from it. And I think that's a good thing for affordability and sustainability of our local economies.
So I think and Brian and I had extensive conversations about this as we saw that there's some definite fear on what that's going to cost the end user. We're having lots of conversation on this forced electrification part of it. And it's really what it's actually going to cost, and is it going to help or exacerbate the housing crisis that we are in right now? And we love Senator Cleve Simpson. We are so blessed. We agree with you. We're so blessed to have him because he brings an authenticity and a reality to the assembly of what's happening here isn't necessarily what's happening there with regard to Colorado. So let's talk about housing, because that's the big crisis. And everybody's giving, we hear a lot of lip service to housing and trying to overcome this. But right now for us, in rural Colorado, it is a crisis. We can't move forward on any kind of building or building back in any way until we get this housing crisis overcome. So there was some good stuff with regard to housing and bridging some gaps. And then there was some stuff like that where we're talking about when we're actually building or actually doing this kind of thing, what it would mean for our rural communities. So can you talk a little bit about the housing, some of the housing bills that we saw this session?
We saw a historic amount of money spent, largely federal funds, on top of all the state funds that Colorado has been successful in adding over the years, to address housing. And it's not just been, we extended the affordable housing tax credit, which is hugely popular. We extended it for 7 years, so it'll add another, let's say, $50 million to affordable housing tax credit that's used from everything from a housing authority to Volunteers of America and private developers to do affordable housing. So we supported that bill, and I felt very good in the third extension of that particular program. They allocated $105 million of federal dollars to really get into homelessness issues. So support to local governments to provide, funding for shelters and things like that. They put millions and millions of dollars, I'm going to say $40 or so million, not just into the traditional bricks and mortar of housing, but a real promotion of manufactured housing in Colorado. Right. I thought, to me, that was of the bills that they did, that quite innovative, and I'm supportive of that. It allowed local governments to use these dollars to actually buy land and to help cover the development cost of those lands, similar to what we just talked about, those expenses we just talked about in the previous Metro District bill. So those kind of attempts, are really, really important. They passed legislation to, I don't want to get it right here. They passed legislation to build more wraparound services. So for folks that are homeless, to really kind of help folks get the services they need. It's not just getting them off the street, but can they get the treatment they need? And really getting into that homeless issue, I think, is one of the most important things that the General Assembly did. And they did it in a bipartisan fashion for the most part. And that's why I hope that we can see, some real success in this area. And again, I want to be clear. I think the Division of Housing and the Department of Local Affairs, they've been given probably over $500 million off the top of my head to spend over the next couple of years. And I think the passing of this legislation was the easy part. We all have a role in helping them achieve success here. Local governments working with Department of Local Affairs to identify these are the things that are important to us, and to make sure that there's a rural voice to this. Life exists outside the city of Denver. Denver is going to be fine. Denver is going to, they have their own federal allocations. They're a wealthy community, but we really need to make sure that places like, Alamosa and Trinidad and Pueblo, Colorado Springs actually are really at the table getting these dollars. And that's what Action 22 will work to navigate. But over $500 million in this space is historic. We'll never see it again. And
understanding how to access that's going to be key.
If we write a check back in 2026 back to the federal government with these dollars, shame on us. You can't just blame the legislature. You got to blame folks like us who didn't do our job to get real good programs and conversations locally going. That's why the housing summit that Action 22 did was so, I've heard nothing but good comments about it. And really getting people educated, because we have to hit the ground running as the ink dries on these bills. And I commend Action 22 for their leadership on that.
Well, thanks. So one more thing on along that line, what our big takeaway was from the Housing Summit is what we're going to do is put together or facilitate sort of a regional strategy for that, because that's the big thing that we know is going to have to happen, is everybody, and it's not something that normally is done. Normally, we have our communities competing, very siloed to compete for the same resources. That's not the case now. They're going to have to be collaborative in a way that, frankly, they've never done before. And so that's the best thing that we can do as an organization, is to facilitate those kinds of conversations on that part of it.
Yeah, facilitate it and also encourage involvement, because you're right. If you're not, get out what you put in, right? And we have to come to the table and make sure that the rural voice is heard on this. I have a couple fun questions for you if you have some time.
Sure.
Okay. At the kickoff of the session, you came on the show, and we kind of threw around the idea with an election coming up where we don't know what side's going to win on at least the Senate. Were they going to go all in or try to work with the other side? Now, I know the answer to this, but looking back at this session, was it all in, or did they encourage collaboration?
Well, it was collaboration in many cases, but it was by hostage situation, right? And what I mean by that is, that as I said earlier in this podcast, that it was difficult for the majority party to figure out how to spend these dollars. And they waited so long that they created a bottleneck in both chambers, which really empowered the minority party, the Republicans, to say, well, look, we're going to filibuster A, B, and C unless we get amendments to D, E, and F. And so honestly, the Republicans were in the minority, but they were quite powerful, especially in the last 2 weeks. And they were able to kill bills, and they were get amendments. And I credit the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate in particular for listening to the minority party. They didn't, frankly, do it just for the good of the cause. They also did it because they had a large agenda they needed to get through in the end. But that's the process, right? It's one of the reasons why I love where I work and what I do, because it doesn't matter whether they wanted to work together or not. They did in the end on some of these bigger ticket items, collective bargaining, fentanyl and criminal justice reform, tax policy, education spending and the School Finance Act. So there were changes made, but it was more, again, through a hostage situation than collaboration. But we'll take coalition building wherever we can get it.
That's true.
Do you think the majority party, they were happy with the end of this, or do you think they were a little upset that they didn't get everything put through that they wanted to?
I think there's a general, I think it's unsettled. I don't want to say unhappy. I think frustration, I guess. Mm-hmm. And honestly, for an election year, I always tell the folks that I represent to get their hopes down or lower their expectations that a lot will get done. This was a historic amount of work that they did in an election year, especially on the spending side and the key issues that I just referenced. There was a lot of bipartisanship. People shouldn't be depressed, right? I mean, there was some hostage situations going on for those key issues, but look at behavioral health and look at housing. Those are really key issues that they did come together to work on. There was a deep-seated attempt on fentanyl to get a compromise that both parties could vote for. At the end, that didn't work. But, I'd rather try and fail than do nothing and have the status quo as a kind of the nerd that I am around this process. And I credit the speaker and others for trying. The
para paying back para, that was a big win, yes?
It really was. I mean, para ended up, I think, over the next few years, getting an extra $1.6 billion to help ease that unfunded liability that exists.
Right.
And, and that was a deal that wasn't done until the very last day of session. And I know that, CML, CCI, the education community, Secure Para and others were quite satisfied with how it turned out. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of para in the next couple of years. They have a new board election coming up.
Right.
And how we fund schools, how we pay teachers in particular will be on the forefront of, is para really doing the job that they need to do? And I think you're going to see their returns because of, I don't know what your retirement looks like, but mine looks terrible after this last year and a market down 20%. So I would imagine para is at a loss this year. And that might be a time we're giving them a bunch of money to buy while things are down right now. And so the question will be is for para and for folks that care about that. And you're in Action 22's footprint. I mean, para is one of the largest contributors to your local economy for those who don't know
something like 40% or something crazy like that.
When you go into places like Pueblo and the San Luis Valley and in Los Animas County, it's a huge contributor to their economy because you have so many retirees and government employees. So that's why, for those wondering, listening, why in the world do we care about that? Because it is a goose that lays a big economic egg in your footprint, and that's why we pay attention. And so I was pleased with the compromise there.
And school finance was another win that I wanted to make sure that we talked about.
Absolutely. We've never put this much money into schools. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's about $8.5 billion into K through 12. So quite a bit more money. We didn't see as many mandates this time as we traditionally see. We saw some compromise on how we do teacher and student assessments from Senator Bridges, the chair of the Senate Education Committee, passed a bill he'd worked on in a couple of years on that assessment front. So that's all really, really good news moving forward.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one more thing. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Also for the first time, I'm seeing, at least on a state level, even federal to a point, that there seems to be more of a focus on rural issues and more involvement from the more metro area. And I think part of that is COVID. And like you said, we can work wherever we want, and people are moving to these rural areas because they cannot afford to live in Denver. Would you agree that they're kind of paying more attention to us down here in the country, us country folk?
My experience is that folks that are vocal and know and let elected and appointed officials that they're paying attention are going to get listened to. And so you'll notice that the narrative this year wasn't either party is conducting a war on rural Colorado. It was more of how can we help rural Colorado. Yeah. I think that narrative that the war on rural Colorado is kind of past us, and now what can we do? to make Colorado more affordable, because I want my kids to live here.
Yeah.
And to stay here. And I think our higher ed, it shouldn't be cheaper to go to San Diego State versus Colorado State, right? And we have to do better and in our education space. And so I really did see a bipartisan commitment to that. And I think we'll see more. So yes, rural Colorado has a place. And I think that's a fitting place for me to interject the following, that Action 22, from where we were a few years ago, we are on the forefront of a strong rural voice, probably the strongest in Colorado, I would argue, and giving legislators from your area, from our 22 counties, kind of the information they need to be better legislators, to be more effective, is not just been it's an obligation that we have. And I think we've really met that and really give a voice to people that haven't had it. And so I couldn't be more pleased to serve on your board and to be a volunteer in that effort. And we made a difference, and we will only do great things from here. And there's real value into being a member of Action 22. And I urge people to do it.
Oh, thank you, Beasley. We appreciate that so much. We're going to leave it on that. We thank you so much for all that you do. I think our board and our members know in particular what you do for us. Every time somebody discovers that Mike Beasley represents us as our lobbyist, they're always sort of just shocked. How in the world did you get Mike Beasley? I had somebody ask me that not too long ago, and I said, they go, why does he do it? And I said, he just genuinely loves serving Coloradans, and he sees Action 22 as a way that can happen. And so we appreciate there's so many people in our area that have been affected by you that have no idea, and they probably never will know what a big champion and advocate, and we genuinely appreciate you for that. So thank you.
Well, it's very kind. I appreciate it. It's my honor. It really is.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for being on the show with us. We have some interesting discussions that are going to be follow-up to the Housing Summit. You're going to hear next week after this show, you're going to hear from a gentleman by the name of Carl Dakin with Dakin Capital, and we're going to be working really closely with him on some of the housing issues that are coming up. And then we've got election stuff. This is going to be now it starts. Now the game really starts, and we're going to see what some of these folks are made of, and who, if they're going to be serving party or serving Coloradans. This is going to be interesting.
And I always have to say this. We do not endorse political candidates, and our views and opinions do not reflect the Board of Action 22 or its membership.
They don't on the show. So nothing that necessarily reflects that. And we don't endorse candidates, but we do support our members, and we have a lot of people who run for office. Just about everybody who's running for office become members of Action 22, and it's because they can have the real discussions about what's actually going on and what needs to happen next. So.
And this platform is open to any Action 22 member running for any level of office whatsoever. An open invitation to come on the show.
To come on the show. We'd love to have you and have some of these discussions. So look for all of this. Chad Vorthman, I know you're listening, and in that vein, I hope you just heard Mike Beasley say what we're that we're the top advocates for rural Colorado. So you can have that discussion with Beasley later. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.